So I don't know what Putin's objectives are concretely for this year. It's my professional opinion that the Kremlin is extremely unlikely to seize all of those four oblasts within that time frame, because if you look at the historical rate of Russian advance throughout the theater, it would actually require the Russians many, many years to seize all of Donetsk Oblast. They still have to fight their way through some of the most difficult, significant fortress cities in Donetsk Oblast, like Drushkivka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinivka, etc. And I would expect the campaigns, not just battles, but the campaigns for the seizures of those cities, that will take many, many years. I would be astonished. I mean, it would require a major departure from the Russian baseline known performance. So either the Russians have to miraculously discover how to restore maneuver to the battlefield and overcome Ukraine's drone defenses overnight, or it would either require a dramatic collapse in the Ukrainian lines that the Russians can exploit. And I assess both of these events are very unlikely. So I think what we'll likely see is a continuation of small tactical Russian gains across fields and villages at extreme costs in terms of Russian casualties. And the Russians very well might not even achieve their objectives. In my assessment, the Russian immediate objective for the summer 2025 campaign is to seize Konstantinivka. And they're setting the conditions for a pitched battle against Konstantinivka. And they very well might seize it if we were to talk again this time in 9 months. But they might not. I mean, last year in 2024, all the analysts, American analysts, British analysts, Ukrainian analysts, we were talking about the Russian campaign for Pokrovsk. And some analysts said that Russia would get Pokrovsk. Some analysts were saying they would not get Pokrovsk. It turned out that despite over 9 months of campaigning in the Avdiivka Pokrovsk direction, the Russians actually indeed culminated around Barros. They never seized the settlement. They came to the outskirts, but then the Russians largely changed their operational objectives, and they have now redeployed units that were previously fighting for Barros to go to Konstantinivka. So now they think the Russians will be able to advance there. So we shall see. But in terms of seizing all of Donetsk Oblast within a short amount of time, that will, I would be very surprised. I would be shocked.
Also, if Putin continues this war for another years, what would this cost for Russia, and how many dilemmas he will face during his war? Because Russians are moving to 1 million losses, killed and wounded, and also Russia has some problems with their economy. For how long they can continue this war, and how many dilemmas they will face on their way in Ukraine?
So there's a couple of variables we have to talk about here. You have to assume that the Russian casualty rate resumes the same. If the Ukrainians do not impose the same levels of casualties, that being about 35 to 45,000 killed and wounded per month, then the Russians will be able to sustain the war longer. But let's assume for this very basic analysis that the Ukrainians maintain the same lethality, that you Russians continue to lose forces at the same rate, roughly 30 to 45,000 troops per month. And then I think the Russians will get to a point where they will have to start making some very difficult decisions within the next 12 to 18 months. I'm not going to say concretely when, and I'm not going to say this is the point at which they break, but there'll be difficult decisions. As you know, the Russian strategy for how to finance this war is not sustainable. The Russians pay extreme amounts of money to volunteers to sign up to a fight in Ukraine. I believe the current running record that we have is between $30,000 and $40,000 for a one-time sign up. That does not include your monthly salary, does not include benefits if you're killed or wounded or other things. And when the Russians lose between 35 to 45,000 killed and wounded per month, I mean, that's a lot of money when you add it up. And this is actively destroying the liquidity in Russia's sovereign wealth fund. The Russian economy is overheating. Too many Russians have too much money and they're spending too much, which is causing inflation. It's very interesting. The Russian central bank just lowered the interest rate, not because I think inflation is no longer an issue, but I think because the Russian government is making some monetarily risky decisions in order to facilitate borrowing and lending so that the Russians can continue keeping the war factories running and keeping the banking class and the business interests happy in Russia. But really, when you look at it, and you can continue to look at the costs and the inflation and the monetary instability and the ballooning Russian budget, this looks to be quite unsustainable. I mean, Russia, when you look at history, whenever they've had to fight a large-scale war that resulted with many casualties, Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers, they would die like slaves. They would be forced to go fight, not compensated for anything. I mean, they were either serf conscripts from the Tsarist imperial model, or they were Soviet conscripts in the Soviet model. But this is not the model that Putin is using. Putin has a new social contract where he pays you. And I think Putin's strategy, it's a politically brilliant because it absolves the Russian state if you're killed or wounded because you took the money. But it's economically stupid. And it can work for a short special military operation, a short war. It does not work for a long protracted war that will go on for 3 to 5 years.
So you're confident that Russia can continue this war with such current intensity for 12, 18 months, and after this period they would have to conduct full-scale mobilization or reach a ceasefire deal?
I think they have to make difficult decisions at 12 to 18 months. So those could be decisions such as, yes, potentially going to a full wartime economy. It could include nationalization of more privately held assets to try to crank out more materiel to support the war effort. It could result with the Kremlin changing its social contract with soldiers. So it could be perhaps not mobilization, but perhaps the incentives will have to be cut severely. So instead of offering, $40,000, we go back to offering just a couple 100,000 rubles or a couple thousand rubles, which would drastically change. And I think you would see much fewer Russian forces come through that time. The Russians might have to change their objectives in Ukraine and scope it down. Or they might, they're going to have to make calls between, do they prioritize the military economy or the domestic civilian economy? And they might revert back to an economic model which looks much more like the Soviet economic model, which is an economy built up for industry and the war industry at the expense of consumer goods. It doesn't mean that the war breaks. It doesn't mean that the war ends. It doesn't mean that the Kremlin now has to declare full-scale war. But Putin will have to make very difficult decisions that I think he doesn't want to. I mean, Putin is happy basically with the political and economic compromises he's made, the trade-offs he's made. But he might be forced out of that. And of course, Russians do not like it when their social agreements, their social contract is violated.
Do you feel that in such cases there could be a threat to Russian regime because there would be a high discontent inside Russia and some people could demonstrate against it, or even people from Putin's circle?
I think that's very unlikely. The power vertical is very strong. Putin has made examples throughout his career of those politicians or oligarchs or Siloviki that go against him. The most recent example being Yevgeny Prigozhin, but there's also, of course, Boris Nemtsov, and going back a bit further, Hodorkovsky with Yukos. So the oligarchs know what waits them if they try to challenge the power vertical. So I don't think that's particularly likely. But that said, it's important because Putin does care about what the oligarchs have to say. He does care what the Siloviki has to say. He is thinking about the regime stability. And if these guys do have issues with the Kremlin, then that causes problems. So I think the risk of a revolt or a coup or revolution very low, but these tensions and these pressures are still nonetheless important, and they deeply influence the way that Putin governs and the decision-making that Putin makes.
You just also mentioned about the Yevgeny Prigozhin's marriage on Moscow. What are the chances for another coup inside Russia, so-called Prigozhin-style marriage on Moscow from different fractions in the Russian army or from mercenaries?
I think it's very, very low. So you should really talk to my colleague, Katerina Stepanenko, who's been doing some excellent research on this topic. But The Russian Ministry of Defense has been conducting a centralization campaign that is designed to very firmly establish the power vertical over all the Russian various different formations and units, including irregular units, proxy units, volunteer battalions, etc. And of course, the whole reason why the Wagner Prigozhin mutiny came to a head is because the Ministry of Defense went to Wagner and said, all Wagner soldiers now have to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense and fall under the administrative control of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And many Russian Wagner soldiers refused to do that because they saw their loyalties primarily to the Wagner group as an institution and not to being, Gerasimovsy or Shoigusy, right? And that's what caused the conflict. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense has now, in the aftermath of the rebellion, decisively won this conflict. All Russian combatants are basically now forced to sign documents and submit themselves to being under the operational control of the Ministry of Defense. The Africa Corps, the Wagner split-off group that went to Africa, that has been subsumed and is now part of the command and control and administrative control of the Russian General Staff and the Ministry of Defense. I mean, this is basically over, with the exception of perhaps a general who is currently loyal to the regime going rogue, which I would argue is a very unlikely occurrence. They've got this under control. I mean, Putin identified the risks that Wagner posed, that Prigozhin posed, and they started to correct the ship. And the situation's much more secure, much more stable now, I would argue.
And do you also see this reason of this Prigozhin coup, because Wagner Group was independent group, independent from Russia's Ministry of Defense, and do you see this as a reason why Russia's Ministry of Defense decided to take control of Wagner Group, because they were afraid of possibility of coup or another actions from Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Yes, that's exactly right. So, Yevgeny Prigozhin became extremely powerful and influential. His organization was in 2023, the Wagner Group was the most effective fighting force in the Russian armed forces. I mean, they did the Battle of Bakhmut. They had a very high, unlike the traditional Russian Ministry of Defense forces, the Wagner Group had very high morale. They had better and more effective leadership than the rest of the Russian Ministry of Defense. The corruption was lower. The loyalty to the troops was higher. It was a better run military organization. And that's because of the unique charter and the institution and the command culture that Yevgeny Prigozhin and the former and Dmitry Utkin, call sign Wagner, that they established within that organization. And it was very attractive and it was very effective. And the men that went to go sign up to fight with Wagner, they saw themselves as Wagner guys. They did not see themselves as Shoigu guys or Gerasimov guys. They were separate. It was sexy. And Yevgeny Prigozhin became increasingly important for the Kremlin because he was the guy you called to get results. When you need to break through in the Battle of Bakhmut and get results, you go to Prigozhin, and Prigozhin would deliver. He was brutal, but he delivered. Prigozhin became full of himself. His ambitions, he choked on his ambitions. He thought that he could do more. He challenged openly the regime. He called into question Shoigu and Gerasimov, their competency, their corruption, and in doing so indirectly challenged Putin's authority and regime, because Putin ultimately, of course, has instated Shoigu and Gerasimov. And when the Kremlin was then trying to say, okay, let's reassert who is in control here. It is the Ministry of Defense. All Wagner soldiers must now sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. They refused. They said they're not going to do that, and that's what ultimately led to the march of so-called March of Justice, the March for the State, and that's what caused that whole drama.
Thank you, George, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Yeah, Ram Slava. Thank you, Daniel. Very nice speaking with you as always.
However, according to the Wall Street Journal, Trump's administration is trying to weaken this bill by communicating with Lindsey Graham's office to amend this bill, remove some interesting statements, and replace the words like shall, might, with other wars like May just to weaken this document and just to make Donald Trump the only person who would be able to decide on whether impose sanctions on Russia. What is your assessment of this new effort of Trump's team to weaken this, at least this sanctions bill against Russia?
It is unsurprising that the Trump team would hold out against the sanctions bill as it is written, not just because they may not want to be that tough with Russia, but also because they would want to have the final decision on whether sanctions could be imposed. But the political reality here is that if the senators stand firm, if 67 senators stand firm, which is a veto-proof majority, if the House of Representatives follows with a 2/3 majority, Donald Trump cannot block this bill. He simply can't, given the way the U.S. system works. So we have a wait and see. We wait and see. Will the senators and the representatives say, no, we're not going to leave it up to you to decide on the extent of sanctions. We do have a say here. If they press this forward, it gives Trump at the very least a difficult choice. Does he try to oppose them, or does he accept what they're doing? And it may even override his authority in this case. So we tend to always have this idea that Donald Trump always makes the final decision in America. That's not the way it happens in the system. We just have to see if Congress finally steps up and does the right thing.
But do you believe that Republicans can be brave enough to make this decision on sanctions against Russia despite Trump's policy, despite his willingness or unwillingness to move forward with sanctions?
I mean, the key question is, will Republicans, as we say in America, put their money where their mouth is? We know that in terms of their rhetoric, they have stood up to the Trump administration in calling for a tougher position. We know this is true not only of individual senators like Lindsey Graham, but many senators, many representatives. But will they, as you put it, be brave enough to turn that into action? I think what we're seeing right now is the maneuvering that's going on. This bill could have been tabled weeks ago, and we're seeing the Trump administration trying to push it back. And we're seeing some senators saying, we're going to make this bill almost watertight. We're going to make sure that it can get passed in Congress. I can't guarantee that this bill will pass, and I certainly can't guarantee it will pass with a veto-proof majority. I do think, however, that this is, on most issues, the Republicans will bend the knee to Trump, especially on domestic issues. I think standing up to Russia over Ukraine is one issue where Republican congressmen have not wanted to be seen as being Trump servants. And that's what gives me at least a little bit of hope that this bill may see the light of day, that it may pass.
Let's also cover a recent statement and recent clash between US President Donald Trump and Elon Musk. It was really interesting to observe, just to see this interesting conversation between both so-called former friends. Do you see the egos of both Trump and Elon Musk as one of the reasons why Musk left the White House?
Well, I think you know the answer to this. I think the egos of Donald Trump and Elon Musk are not just one reason why they've had this divorce. I think it is perhaps the reason. These are two narcissists. These are two men who not only express a confidence in what they do, they always want to be what we would call top dog. Now, it had been the position from January until last week that because the Trump administration relied on Elon Musk to almost destroy the U.S. government, to take his chainsaw to the agencies, to fire people, to force them to be loyal to Trump, to try to steal their information, strip their budgets, that Musk and Trump were kind of codependent on each other. But there were issues, there were difficulties. Elon Musk did not favor high tariffs on China, because his Tesla company gets many of its components from China. for the electric vehicles. Elon Musk was upset that his choice to head America's space agency, NASA, was blocked by some of Trump's advisors. And Elon Musk was in the middle of a dispute with some cabinet ministers, especially the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, about what he could and could not do. And indeed, he and Scott Bessent had a stand-up fight a few weeks ago in the White House. So there was this tension that was building. And then what pushed it over the edge is that Elon Musk sided with a minority, but an important group of Republican legislators who opposed Trump's tax cuts, spending cuts, and anti-immigrant legislation. Specifically, Musk came out in support of those legislators and said there needed to be even bigger spending cuts because this bill increases the U.S. deficit by $2.4 trillion over 10 years. And when Musk said that, especially when he called it a massive abomination, that triggered Trump. And so with the German chancellor alongside him last Thursday, he started to insult Musk. He said Musk had disappointed him. He implied that Musk was using drugs, something that he has come out and said privately to his aides. And he said that Musk was suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. So this became a personal battle. It wasn't just about the tax and the spending bill. It was now personal. And when you get men with big egos who get personal with each other, then this can get very serious.
Do you believe that Elon Musk can destroy political figure of Donald Trump, his current political position, by criticizing him on social media and also by creating another party, as he suggested?
Elon Musk can make life difficult for Trump. I mean, and let's start with the question of this, what Trump calls his big, beautiful bill. These massive tax cuts, cutting programs like healthcare, increasing defense spending, cracking down on migrants. It only takes 4 senators of the 53 Republicans in the upper chamber to vote no, and that would just block this bill. Well, there are already at least 4 Republican senators who've expressed doubts about this, and Elon Musk can magnify and endorse their opposition, and indeed he has done so. Now, if that bill does not pass, Donald Trump looks politically weak. He has not actually achieved the one major bill that he has proposed so far in his second term. Beyond that, I don't think Elon Musk will join the Democratic Party. I don't think the Democratic Party will have Musk, to be honest with you. I don't think Musk will form a third party. It's very tough to get a third party to succeed in U.S. politics. But Elon Musk can run or support opponents of Donald Trump's candidates in next year's congressional elections. Remember, in the U.S. system, you have what we call primaries, where the Republicans pick their candidates for the Senate and for the House. And Donald Trump might be supporting a particular Republican, and Elon Musk will say, well, I'll support this other guy. And he has a lot of money that he can put into that. And indeed, this is exactly how Donald Trump took control of the Republican Party. He ran his people against Republican incumbents, got a lot of them into the Senate and into the House of Representatives. Now, if Musk can do the same thing, he poses the same problem for Donald Trump that Donald Trump posed for Republicans several years ago.
Let's also cover another interesting battle clash between U.S. President Donald Trump and California Governor Christopher Newsom. Also, Trump decided to deploy National Guard to Los Angeles amid current protests. What is your assessment of this another Trump's clash between his office and California Governor's office?
Donald Trump has disliked Gavin Newsom for quite some time. And indeed, Donald Trump has tried to curb the powers of California as a state for some time. But this is a much wider issue, and arguably one that points to the level of the crisis within the United States. This possible crisis starts with the Trump administration's attempt for mass deportation and indeed detention, disappearance of migrants and asylum seekers, just sweeping them off the streets, not giving them a hearing, denying them the rule of law, in some cases sending hundreds to El Salvador and hiding them in that prison there where they cannot be found by their families or indeed by lawyers. Now, when they tried to do this in California in recent days, it started protests, especially in Los Angeles near the detention facility. Now, these protests were largely peaceful. I have to emphasize this. On Saturday night, there were only two protesters that were arrested for assaults on police officers. But that became the excuse for the Trump administration, first of all, to call up the National Guard. And they now have 4,000 people from the National Guard in Los Angeles. And then to call up 700 Marines. Now, they probably do not have the constitutional authority to do this. I could explain this to you in a longer interview. But in effect, they are defying the law and they're defying the state government because the National Guard is actually part of the state forces, not the national forces. They're defying the governor of California. They're defying the mayor of Los Angeles to do two things. One is they're doing it so that they cannot be opposed on what they do regarding immigration. But more widely, they're doing it to militarize the United States, to use the military as part of their attempt to expand their powers. If this happened in another country, you would call it authoritarian. And indeed, although I think the U.S. is a long way even from being China or Vladimir Putin's Russia or even Viktor Orban's Hungary, certainly the Trump administration is going that way. And one way, if you're an authoritarian, is you take control of military forces and you use them against your own people. These protests are over a serious issue. These protests largely had been within the law. So we need to be very clear here. That as Donald Trump prepares for a celebration with a military parade in Washington on Saturday, the day that he turns 79, he wants to show that he has all the power in the United States, that it does not belong to the states or to the courts or even to Congress.
And also, do you see the California governor, Mr. Newsom, as a possible candidate from the Democratic Party at the next U.S. general election?
Certainly, Gavin Newsom has been mentioned as a possible candidate for president for the Democrats. Indeed, he was mentioned even after Joe Biden stepped down, and again in 2028. But I think it's a very open race for that presidential nomination. And I think it's very difficult for a Democrat from California to get that nomination. I realize that Kamala Harris was from California. That was kind of a special case. California is portrayed by the Republicans as being a very liberal state that is not representative of America. The Democrats, I think, are much more likely to go from a candidate that is from a swing state. You could think about a Governor Whitmer of Michigan, a Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, a Governor Pritzker of Illinois, or indeed from a state which is Republican, and that's the Democratic Governor Beshear from Kentucky. So no, I don't think Gavin Newsom's presidential ambitions, if they are there, are not at the center of this conflict over the military being deployed in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank your viewers. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.